Thanks, Massimo. Thanks for having me. And actually, the two papers that Massimo just mentioned that have just come out are also part of this project, and I am working on a book, which eventually will be finished. I'm going to do something a little different from what I usually do for such a talk, and it's going to be a little bit more informal than, I don't have my text written out in short, and so I'm going to be trying to use the slides and guide you through some of the ins and outs of this landscape, and I'm talking particularly about not households in general, but one particular household, and it's the household of Réaumur. As Massimo mentioned, he's at the center of the book I'm working on, kind of in spite of himself, because I really didn't want to write another book about one person. But, and it's not only about one person, but he is a mover and shaker in natural history in the middle of the 18th century. And I'm looking at all of the different kinds of work that he was involved in and the people that he was connected to, which actually spreads all over the world as well as all over Europe. But today I'm going to be focusing on his household. So he lived until 1757. This is the title page from his sort of core natural history work, which is on insects, which came out in 6 volumes, as you'll see, in the 1730s and 40s. But I just want to say, before I get into the details, and just as kind of setting the scene here, a little bit about Réaumur and his setting, and his family background, to say that, first of all, he was really vigorously active in the Paris Academy of Sciences. He was a prolific academician and worked in all kinds of different areas, from not only in natural history, in other words, he was involved in lots of technological projects. He was, for a time, the director of the Academy's Description des Arts et Métiers, which was a project that never came to completion in his lifetime, but led into the Encyclopédie later on. So he was involved in lots of what we might call technological or practical application type projects, better methods for making porcelain, for making steel, for making paper, that type of thing. And ultimately, in the big view, those projects, I think, were related to his natural history, although I'm not going to be talking about them in any detail today. He was also famous for devising a thermometric scale, which was in use for, well, a long time. You can still probably find Réaumur thermometers, but certainly that his thermometers were sent, all over the world and used for generations, and that's one of the things that he's known for, the Réaumur scale. But what I'm trying to do in this project is to talk about natural history as experimental science, and I'll give you some examples of what I mean by that as I go along. I also want to mention that Réaumur himself came from he was a member of the landed nobility. That is, he's not a titled aristocrat, but he is a landholder. His lands were in western France, in the Vendée. I'll show you a map in a minute. And that's important because he had resources, not only in terms of wealth, but in terms of his estates and his homes, of which he had several and he moved several times, were allowed him, made possible certain kinds of work that I'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. But it's important to remember now, there were a number of people in the Academy of Sciences who had similar positions, socially, but it certainly wasn't required, if you were in the Academy of Sciences, that you be an aristocrat. But I think the kind of science we're looking at here is, in some sense, aristocratic science. But in others, it's also true that Réaumur gave up his life as a provincial seigneur to come to Paris and to be a man of science, and that was a conscious choice. He was the elder son. He had a younger brother who ran the estate until he died, And after the death of his brother, Réaumur actually, and this is relevant for all of this too, because he traveled every autumn for the Academy vacation to his ancestral estates in Poitou, where, in fact, he also did natural history. Okay, so just to give you kind of a sense of where this is coming from, what I'm interested in the bigger picture is what kind of work is natural history and what people were involved with it and where the work was done. And that's why I'm looking at households. I also, in the bigger project, look at the academy. But I think it's worth thinking about I'm not sure what you think of when I say natural history, but for the 18th century, natural history is very often associated with classification or description. And while both of those things kind of come into it, what I found as I've gotten more and more into this material is that the people that I'm interested in really don't spend their time worrying about what category to put things in. They're much more interested in figuring out what's going on in the natural world. And for somebody who works on insects, that means sitting down and watching insects for hours on end. But it also means cultivating them, dissecting them, getting them to metamorphose in front of your eyes, and so on. And so that's the kind of side of this sort of natural science that I'm interested in, less so in the taxonomy, which doesn't seem to me really what they care about. And this kind of work takes place in all sorts of settings, indoors and outdoors, and the fields and forests and gardens, but also in people's studies and their poultry yards and their basements and their bedrooms. So I don't want to suggest that by saying that this kind of science takes place in households that it's on the periphery of what we might call official science. It's very much connected to the Academy of Sciences in the case of Réaumur. And somebody like Réaumur, for example, goes to the Academy. They meet twice a week, and which is where he presents his work and he, exchanges gossip and so on with his colleagues. But where his actual researches are done is in his home, and in this very extensive setup in his home that I'll talk about in a second. Okay, so what I'm interested in is figuring out how to integrate the scientific work into the daily lives, or how they integrated their scientific work into their daily lives. And that, in a certain sense, I've come to see this project as being a sort of natural history of these naturalists. By looking at their daily lives, except that, of course, I don't have the luxury of having them constantly in view, and I have to keep figuring out ways of how do I know what they did on a daily basis, right? So, I can't really watch them the way they watch their caterpillars, which is probably a good thing, but what I'm also interested in is how do you go about reconstructing mundane activities, and how, part of that is locating them. And so I'm going to be talking as I go along a little bit about what kind of sources we have for doing this kind of historical work without going on about it at any great length. But you'll see that I'm using different kinds of sources, and I just want to point to that because it took me a long time to really kind of figure out that a lot of the sorts of details that accumulate to allow this sort of reconstruction of daily life are often sort of hidden in plain sight because they tend to be sort of throwaway lines or little mini narratives that are buried in descriptions of insects or whatever. And I've been able to pull out from those things a lot of these details about who was there, or what were they doing, et cetera. I'll give you some more examples in a sec. So what I really want to do in this talk, and I hope I don't have too much packed in here, is to track Réaumur's extensive household sort of through space as well as through time. I'm not going to do that in great detail, but I'm looking at this household as a kind of flexible unit because people come into it and go out of it. That is, people move in for a time and then leave and somebody else moves into it. It's not a family. And especially in Réaumur's case, he was a bachelor, lifelong bachelor. As I mentioned, he did have a brother but who lived in the provinces, but the brother died. And so he had essentially no family, except that, of course, he had an extended family, various cousins and so on. But he did have assistants and collaborators of various sorts who came and went. And the household, which he lived in Paris, but he also had, in fact, I have a map. Look at that. I hope you can see that. You don't have to see it in any detail. This is actually a map of Paris, which is not oriented the way maps of Paris usually are now. But this is the river, and this is the right bank, for anybody who's familiar with that. And I really only put this up, just schematically, to show you that, okay, so he does have a household. It's in Paris. These are two of the places he lived in the city. He also had a country house out at Charenton, which is off the map. And I'll talk more about that in a second. And then after 1740, he moved to the Faubourg Saint-Antoine, which is now within the city of Paris, but was then much more wide open. As you can see, not as many streets. And I'll show you some pictures in a second. But the deal is, and he also had his provincial estate where he went every fall. So the household actually moves quite a bit because when he goes out to Charenton, to his country house, where he spent sometimes only a few nights at a time and sometimes weeks at a time, like everybody went with him, including his assistants, his artists, his servants, et cetera. And people came to visit him there. And so the household, if you say household, it sort of sounds like, yeah, you live in one place and you have, even if you say it's an extended family or whatever. But in this case, it's actually, they're moving quite a bit. And there are particular features of the different houses and the different settings for the houses that are completely relevant, that feed into what kind of natural history gets done. So it's not just, I guess I've gotten kind of obsessed with trying to figure out as much as I can about these different places, including the buildings, what kind of spaces were there and stuff. And you can fall into a kind of antiquarianism, which is not what I want to do, but actually the work of people who are antiquarians or architectural historians of a very old-fashioned variety can be really, really useful here if you can find the right article, right? But I do think it's relevant to know, what these spaces were like and what was there in terms of working spaces, especially, but also living spaces. Okay, so right. So now I'm going to talk about Charenton to begin with, or something. Let's see. Okay, I guess first I want to say, before I get to Charenton, I want to say that, it's not particularly surprising to learn that there were other people involved in producing this kind of work, right? But the question is, how do we know, who was involved and what their investment was in it, and sort of who was on the scene and what they were doing there? And the first source for this kind of information is, in fact, print. And not surprisingly, right? Because that's the most easily accessible to us. And that book that I showed you the title page of, the Memoirs on Insects, is actually a very rich source for this. Because far from being just a description of all the different species of insects, he very often tells you how he managed to see what he's describing. And he very often mentions, who else saw it, or who sent him something, or where he was when he did made certain kinds of observations. So he says things like, he puts in sort of identifying features, like he says, this is apropos, I guess, both of these pictures. Towards the end of June 1730, several of these caterpillars attached themselves at my house, either underneath some leaves or against the lids of the bottles where I had enclosed them, with threads of silk that I so much wished to see them working on, and eventually several of them attached themselves in front of my eyes. And this is just like one of millions of such examples that then tell you that, okay, this happens not just in a particular time and place, but you can start imagining him in his workroom with these caterpillars and jars, and he tells you at various times that You know, he's got hundreds of them, and if you're, this is actually, you can't see it very well, but this is the caterpillar breaking out of its skin and turning into the chrysalis, which happens in various stages. And this is a really hard thing to see. It's very elusive. It happens over a couple of minutes. I mean, he explains that in order to really see this and also to draw it, and the images I'm going to talk about in a second, you have to have hundreds of these things. And you have to have them all ready to go. And you have to be sitting there. And as soon as you see a sign of motion, you focus in on it. And then you take the, like, here's one that's sort of partially out. You take it and drop it into alcohol so it'll freeze it in a way so that your artist can then draw it, because otherwise it just all happens and it's gone. So all I'm saying here is that this little description allows us to see into actually quite a bit about you know, what's going on in that room, even though he's not saying specifically, like in this case, who else was there. Okay, and this is one of the few images I have of what I think of as kind of a working space, even though it's idealized. But it shows you the different kinds of setups, both inside and outside, for investigating all kinds of different things. I guess you can't see that all super well, but this is a rack, for example, with the chrysalises hanging on it. And this is a table with all these different jars. And I think from his descriptions that, in fact, he would have had many more than this at one time. But this image is just to show you all the different variety of things that would have been. Sort of all these investigations are underway at the same time. So he says at various times things like, you know, in wanting to see the butterfly hatch out of its chrysalis, he said, I realized that since this is another thing, that if you're not looking when it's happening, you miss it, right? So he said he had hundreds of these things, and he pins them to the tapestry that hangs on his wall, and he's sitting at his work table, you know, writing or whatever he's doing, and as soon as he, like, detects any sign of motion, he goes over and focuses on it in that way. And it's true, if you take 100 chrysalises and you hang them on the tapestry on your wall, you're going to see some of the butterflies come out, right? You know, or he says, you know, he wanted to investigate the effect of temperature on the metamorphosis. So he said, I took a bunch of chrysalises and I took them down to the cellar where it was cool, and then I took another bunch and took them out to the greenhouse. So that tells you that, you know, he's working between these different spaces. Okay, now sometimes he mentions assistants and others, but we really only get glimpses of these people in the printed sources. So these kind of mundane contributions are often masked in print, which I guess is also what we would kind of expect. But as I mentioned, the images are essential to these insect books. Now, in the first volume of this many-volume work, he mentions several people who made the drawings for him. Most of the drawings were made by an artist called Philippe Simoneau, who was also an engraver, and he had done a lot of work for the Academy of Sciences over the years. But he didn't really have enough time to do all the work that Réaumur wanted him to do. And so this is Réaumur explaining this, right, in print. He had trained a young man to be his illustrator, and he said everything was going great, and he did some great drawings, but then he died unexpectedly, right? So now that young man would have been living in his household, by the way. But then he goes on in the same passage to introduce the artist who ended up doing all these, all the illustrations for the subsequent book. Some of you have heard me talk about this artist before. But here he says some of these drawings in volume 1, and actually all the drawings in the subsequent volumes, were made by someone of the same sex as the person who drew the insects of Suriname. And that's like a really long-winded way to say she was a woman, right? Because that's Maria Sibylla Marion there. And he goes on to say, she doesn't allow me to name her. And he describes her natural genius and her aptitude and so on. The pleasure she took in these drawings allows me to promise for subsequent volumes a good number of drawings and so on. So the point here is that he's identifying his artist. She's unusual, right? 'Cause she's a woman, although there are women illustrators in this period, not a lot. And, but he's not naming her, right? So we don't yet know who she is. So, who was this person? It turns out that there's several kinds of evidence that I found that we have for identifying her. In fact, it turns out that he named her in his will. That's her name, Mademoiselle Hélène Dumoutier de Marcilly. And in his will, he says the reason he's so grateful to her is because of her talent for drawing, and that, in fact, that's what made it possible for him to do this work. So now, in a certain sense, even though we have a name, it's even more mysterious in a sense, because who is this person? And this has actually driven my quest for the past N years into the Archives Nationales and God knows where, notarial documents, which I had no idea how to read. Now I can read them. So I want to start putting her into this picture, because she turns out to be a really essential part of the story, as he says himself right here. All right, I think I'm going to use my, okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Charenton. This is where his country house was, which he had as a secondary residence for decades. And this is just a map. I don't have a picture of the house, sadly, but the relevant thing is here is it's one of these houses, I don't know which one, right in here. It's right by the river, which is relevant for studying aquatic insects, and it has a lot of space, gardens, and so on. It's a nice place. He has lots of visitors there, and so on. One of the things that he and various other people studied at Charenton was frogs. And these are just, I mean, this is just an image of the documents. This work is not published. It is actually the basis for the paper that I wrote. It's in this book. But the documents are not published, so it wasn't a study that kind of came to completion that he published, but the notes are there, kind of in a random mess like this in the Academy of Sciences archives. Okay, so, right. I guess I'll say, what do I want to say about this before I give you the next slide? Okay, I guess I'm just going to cruise through this. One of the people who was there was his assistant, the Abbé Nollet, and one of the things they did they're trying to figure out how frogs' eggs are fertilized is, as he says here, we put a pair of pants made of bladder tightly closed around the behind on a male frog coupled to the female from the day before, and so on. Frogs, when they mate, they sort of glom together and stay that way for a long time, and it was kind of, I mean, it might sound like obvious how frogs fertilize their eggs, but it turns out that it's not actually obvious. There was a lot of debate about, is it possible that the male fertilizes or somehow helps with the laying of the eggs by squeezing the female, or maybe something's going through the fingers, or is it happening outside the body or inside the body or whatever. So this was their great inspiration, right? Now, when I came across this, I thought, well, in fact, this is what, putting, my question was, okay, so who made the pants, right? And if you recall that image of Réaumur in his lacy cuffs, and was was he doing this himself, And ultimately, I'm making a long story very short here. I found a recollection by this assistant, the Abbé Nollet, from years later, who recalled when he worked with Réaumur that he says, we put taffeta pants, these pants, I didn't actually have this in this, they're made of waxed taffeta eventually. The first pair was made of bladder, but the second pair was made of waxed taffeta. Nollet recalled this, and so I knew, okay, Nollet was there, right? He was there in Charenton, he's stitching up. But I didn't at that point, however hard I looked in the Academy of Sciences, I couldn't find any pictures. I did eventually, however, find some images, and there it is, in the Museum of Natural History archives. These are the pants, and actually, I skipped the part about the suspenders. These are the suspenders, the straps, and that you need because otherwise a frog actually jumps out of the pants, which kind of defeats the purpose. But I found these images in the Museum of Natural History in a whole pile of drawings that were by Mademoiselle de Moutier. And she clearly did these drawings. but she also appears in the notes. And so by the time, I haven't gone through all the notes here, but there is a place in these notes where they're trying to, this goes on over several years over in the spring season, and they're trying to actually see the fertilization of the eggs. And he describes at a certain point that he had 12 pairs of mating frogs, and he says, I kept 8 for myself, and I gave 2 to Mademoiselle de Moutier and 2 to Monsieur Guettard, another assistant. And so from that, just from that one line, you can see that, there were probably other people there too, but there are these 3 people who are like really focused on this, rather bizarre thing, which is like you got to keep staring at the frogs until like something comes out of the rear end of the frog. And in fact, it was Mademoiselle de Moutier who saw it. And again, the only place that you find this is in these, sort of random observation notes that are, were shoved in a box somewhere and whatever. The images, I think I have another one of these, yeah. That's the image of the eggs actually coming out. Geez, you can't really see that very well, can you? Oh, well. Okay, so, the other thing I wanted to mention is that another thing that Réaumur says in his will is that not only did she do the drawings, but that she made some key observations over the years, he doesn't, but he can never name her in the text. But what he does instead is every time he mentions an observation that she made, now this is obviously in print, oh thank you, is he puts these asterisks. And so, you wouldn't necessarily notice this unless you were looking for it, and like there's 6 volumes and they're like this thick, and there's not that many of these, but I think I found all of them by now. So there are lots of places throughout this text where he says, while she was drawing these slices of grain, she noticed this, or while she was drawing one of these caterpillars, the cat jumped up on the table and whatever, that give you, again, a glimpse into the daily life. But in print, she exists as these ellipses. And it was also at her request that he was doing that. Okay, so I think I want to say just a little bit more about the kinds of work that were done at this country house. And the point about the frogs is that it happened at the country house because there was a pond at the country house. And there was a population of mating frogs that they could, enclose and commandeer and bring into the house. And there's a lot of different elements to this episode. There were other kinds of work that went on there too. This is observations of bees. And you can maybe vaguely see people observing these beehives that have these glass windows so that you can see what's going on in the hive. The question of the dynamics of the beehive, of course, at the time were not well understood. And there are interesting things to say about this, but I won't pause over this. And this is another one that I like for showing what went on at Charenton, because these are the steps that go right from the garden that go right down to the river. And this is a mayfly, they're ephemera that hatch. They hatch and live for a very short time. And if you know when they're going to hatch, which you know because the fishermen tell you that they've been observing the signs and they know when it's going to happen, you invite all your friends, and you can see the ladies and gentlemen there who are the guests, and you bring torches down to the river, and you get a scene like this. It's happening at nighttime. And so I think this also is another little window onto the kind of activity. Now, when represented like this, it's an amusement, right? It's a pastime. But the mayflies and the life cycle of the mayfly is also something that takes some serious work to decipher. Is something that he worked on over time. And this is the chunk of the riverbank with where the larvae are deposed, and this is like the different stages. I won't go through it in detail. But the point is, again, this is work that was done there because the river was there, and he had the fishermen with the boat and so on. They're drawn by Dumoutier because she was also there. And it becomes clear after looking at all the images that she drew that she had to have been there at, in many, many, many different contexts, and like basically all the time, which I think is also telling. Okay, now I'm going to move back to the city, to one of the other residences, and this is where he lived from 1728 to 1736, his city residence. And a couple interesting things about this, it's actually right around here that he lived. And this is the Louvre, and that is where the Academy met. So in other words, he lived like 2 blocks from where he had to go to the Academy meeting. It's a very nice neighborhood. This is the Tuileries and the Palais Royal and so on. But he lived in a, these are taken from old maps where they actually put in schematically the houses. This is the house here. It's pretty big, and this is the garden. It's called the Hôtel de Rambouillet, which is what is 17th century name. It was built for the Marquise de Rambouillet, who was a famous 17th century salonière, I guess you would say. So it was kind of a famous house, but by the 18th century, he was renting it, actually. He didn't own this house. He was renting it from the current duke, who was the owner. But the point here is that he's got a lot of space and a big garden, but there's a lot of space in this house for collections, this is where he had the first iteration of his natural history collection, which I'll talk more about in a minute. But he also had rooms for doing the kind of work that we saw in the images of the work tables with all the insects and so on. He had a collection of living insects the insects that were cultivated, and so you need space to do that sort of thing, obviously. But also, he was able to house various of his assistants. And now I want to go back to Mademoiselle de Moutier, because after I had what he said about her in the will, and I had her appearance in these various places in the notes and in print. And I started to, and she also shows up in the documents that were the inventory after his death, because since she was named in his will, she was part of all that. But there were lots of things that I still didn't know about her, like how old she was and what her family was, what kind of family she came from and stuff. And again, cutting a long story short, I just found last summer a document which was generated in the court case that followed his death, having to do with the contestation of the will. And it was an interrogation of her. At that point, she was in her 60s. And it was really weird when I found this thing, because it was like there was a lawyer there who had been given this list of questions by the person who was challenging the will. And he was asking her at the beginning of it is about her background and stuff. It's like he was asking her all the same questions I would have asked her if I had had her sitting there. It was really spooky. And, like, how did you get to know Monsieur de Réaumur? And that was something that I'd really, really never been able to figure out. I had found her birth record before that, so I knew how old she was. But it turns out that there was a family connection. She wasn't related to him, but it was like the niece of her father was married to his friend or whatever. It was a family connection like that. But also that she says at various places in this interrogation, there's a bunch of clues about who else was living in the household. And come to find out, she, her mother, and her sisters lived in the household. Or they rented space in this house initially, and I don't know which space it was. I wish I could point to it and tell you, but they had an apartment, and they essentially sublet it from him. So the fact that you can see in the plates of insects that she was drawing all this stuff and she must have been around all the time. Well, she was around all the time because she actually lived there. And so, and you can see that obviously once you know that like looking at the household as this flexible, fungible unit is, you know, the reason I'm going there is because actually Mademoiselle de Moutier was part of this household, but not only her, but her mother and her sisters. So, yeah, what the exact relationship was between her and Réaumur is like impossible, I think, to decipher. In this interrogation, the woman, the aged relative who was challenging the validity of Réaumur's will was insinuating that there was something improper about this relationship, but it isn't clear to me at all that that was the case. I think that that was being insinuated because she had an interest in the property. And also, you know, there were other people living in the household. There were other people who, Réaumur employed a number of people over the years who were there for short periods of time, you know, a couple years, a year, a couple years, 3 years, whatever. And very often, these people went on to careers in the Academy of Sciences or as doctors or whatever. Abbé Nollet is maybe the most famous of them. But yeah, so, but the point is there was room for these people in the household as well. But I guess what I want to say here is that it's not much of this work, of this observational and experimental natural history is not the kind of work that you can do, you know, on a sort of set schedule. A lot of it is sort of, it's important that you're present all the time and that it's part of the household. It's sort of like astronomy that way, right? The astronomical households also, people have to live at the observatory, right? Because they have to stay up all night watching the stars. Okay, so she and her family are actually living in the household. And not only that, but they're going, the whole family goes with Réaumur and whoever else he happens to be taking along on these annual 2-month trips to his estate in Poitou. Oh, those are just some drawings by her. That's the interrogation. Sorry, I missed that. Okay, I just wanted to show you this. So this is where his, roughly speaking, I figured out how to put stars on maps in PowerPoint the other day. I was like, whoa, this is really cool. And roughly speaking, that's where it is, just to show you. It takes like, I don't know, 8 or 9 days to get there by carriage. I happened to go there last summer, and that's the entrance to the village. I'd never been there before, and that's the house. So it's a, you know, they call it a manor house. It's a big house. It's not enormous, however, but, you know, it's the country house. It's a sort of standard French village country house, I guess you could say. So the point here is that when Réaumur went to his provincial estate for his academic vacation, he went there to work. Sound familiar? Oh, God. But he went there to do the kinds of observations that you could do being in a place in the country and so on. And we can localize, you know, a lot of the different kinds of things. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but there are a lot of places where you can tell this is where he was doing this. Yes, and he also sometimes brought with him, in addition to his illustrator, other assistants. In fact, there was a period when one of his, well, he's actually a friend who needed to get out of Paris for some reason, and spent a couple years living in this place, like around the year, and communicating or corresponding with Réaumur even after he went back to Paris, and the guy continued to do the experiments that they had started during the vacation period. So the point here is that this house, while it was, it was the source of revenue for Réaumur, obviously, because the it's the center of a whole system of lands that were rented out to tenants and so on. And he had to go there for management reasons, but he also went there to continue his natural history work. And so this is just yet another one of these settings. It's a house from the other side. Okay, so there are all these different locations where you can situate the different elements in his work. And again, I'm not doing this in any detail here, but it can be done. And again, I guess I should say also that, one of the problems with this kind of work is just managing the details, because you can, as the naturalists themselves also had to manage details, right? But you can really end up drowning in this stuff. And yeah, so what I've had to do working on this is like figure out ways of charting it out and using sort of like vignettes, like the literal vignettes that we saw the images of, to have a look into, what kind of work was done here without like going through it all exhaustively, which would really just be too much. But it is kind of striking how many of these different settings there are for this one career, and they're all, they're all tied to like a whole variety of different kinds of work. Now, this is the residence in the Faubourg Saint-Antoine. This is when he moved out of the center of Paris, and at this point in 1740, he gave up his country house in Charenton because this residence, which also was rented, had a lot of the features that the Charenton house had, and he didn't need both of them. Okay, so, and I've listed some people who were also living there. Not really sure if all of these people they weren't all living there for the entire period, okay, but these are people that actually have evidence that they were living there for some of this period. Certainly, Dumoutier and her mother ended up dying at some point when they lived there, as did one of her sisters. But anyway, it's a big household. It's a big household. It has a big garden. It has, I don't know, I'm not sure exactly how the buildings work. There's stables. There's a poultry yard, importantly. There's lots of room for his collection. That's the other thing. When Réaumur died, his collection of natural history objects, which included minerals, animals, birds, insects, took up like 7 rooms in this house on the second floor. And so much of the second floor of this house was given over to his collections. And I think that's actually the reason he moved into this house, because when he moved, he wanted to expand into the world of birds, which he hadn't worked with before, and that's why there's a taxidermist on the payroll. Because birds are actually not that easy to keep in your collection because they tend to be eaten by insects or rot or whatever. So you need to develop techniques for preserving them. The other kind of work that I can localize to this setting is work with chickens, chicken breeding. He developed methods for incubating chickens. Oh, I just found this the other day. It's like I hadn't seen any image of the actual house. This is a view of the house as viewed from the garden. It's kind of crappy quality, but this is a view from the terrace out over the garden. Chickens. So Réaumur was, and we might call a chicken fancier, I guess. In the inventory after his death, there's something like, I don't know, 40 different kinds of chickens, some huge number of chickens, I can't remember, but these are 2 of them. And he actually engaged in breeding experiments to try to track, well, it's the question of inheritance, right? Whether traits are passed through the male or the female or both lines. And if you, in a nutshell, right? If you think that the embryo or the organism is contained in a germ that is carried either in the male or the female line, then you shouldn't see this kind of mixing of traits or whatever. So he designed these breeding experiments to do crosses, and they, picking one trait or another, one of these combs or extra claws or whatever. And this is work, again, that wasn't published, but there are manuscript notes about it. But the point here is that in order to do this kind of work, you have to have a place where you have chicken houses and someone to keep track of the chickens, and et cetera. So this is his work on chickens, which is a whole, he wrote, he didn't write up the breeding stuff, but he developed a artificial incubator for chicken eggs, and that was work that was done in this setting. Yeah, I just wanted to say a few words about the, and if I was doing this in a more elegant way, I think I would focus now a little bit more on the people who were involved with the collection, the assistants who were involved in the collection that I mentioned before. There was Brisson and Hérisson. I don't really have time to do that systematically, so I'm just going to kind of gesture at this. Because I think it's really an important part of this whole story is how the collections were it's not just that he had a collection, he was a collector, he had a collection, that is true, but it's also that the work that went into building, maintaining, and having people visit the collection was part and parcel of the regular work of whatever other projects were going on at the same time, whether it was the chicken breeding or experimenting with taxidermy or whatever. At this period, he wasn't doing too much with insects anymore, except that he got really interested in the insects that eat the birds that were in the collection, right? Yeah, so, and the point here is that the collection, as it expanded to take up more and more rooms, required somebody to be working on it all the time. And so, you know, Brisson was that person, but Brisson was also building thermometers and barometers and engaging in correspondence, and I don't even know all the things that Brisson was doing. So managing the collection was only one of the things he did. And eventually, eventually it was after Réaumur's death, Brisson wrote a book on ornithology, which was really, it's a very cut and dried book with descriptions of all the different species of birds, but it's based on Réaumur's collection, and therefore it's a record of the collection in a way that we don't have for any other portion of the collection. I mean, kind of. It's not a catalog of the collection, it's an ornithology. But Brisson, very conveniently for the historian, at the end of each description, he will note whether he was describing it from a specimen in Réaumur's collection, and if so, he'll note, if it wasn't collected by Réaumur himself, which many of them were, he'll note who sent it. And what you can conclude from that is that the collection was built up from the contributions of people, and in the case of the birds, they really are people all over the world. To bring this back to my households theme, since the collection is housed there on the second floor of the mansion, but each specimen in the collection, if it comes from far away, has a little label on it, and it says not only the name of the bird, but it says the name of the person who sent it. So if you're walking through the collection, and by the way, this collection was open to visitors, so many people walked through it, you're not only walking through, you know, a sort of condensed version of nature, as it were, but you're also walking through a version of Réaumur's correspondence network, and you're also walking through the results of all the work that goes into preserving and labeling and so on that was done by these various assistants. Yeah, so in a way, you can map out from, at this point, from the collection, because it has these labels that says who sent them, and they're like people all over, and in many cases I have correspondence from these people, you can map the connections of this household location out into the world via these correspondences, which are they're usually with someone who, there's some kind of personal connection usually. It's usually somebody he knows or he knows of. But yeah, so, and here I just have some images from this book, which I actually read down here in Bancroft. We don't have it at UCLA. Yeah, and I'm not going to do this in any detail, but these birds, for example, what is Terrall? Dove, I think, right? They're doves from all different parts of the world. And each, although you don't see this in the image, you have to see it in the text, each one of these doves from all these different parts of the world would have a label showing, who it was, who sent it. So in a way, it's a collection of contributors as well as a collection of birds. Okay, so you get the idea. This goes on for like 6 volumes. Okay, so just to finish up here, what are some of the sort of summary points here? Okay, so I hope you've seen like some of the virtues of looking at the household as a site for doing all of these different kinds of work. And again, there are many other kinds of work going on in these places. He also had laboratories. He had in Charenton, he had a furnace where he did his porcelain work and things like that I didn't have time to go into. But we always have to think about like how do we define the household? And I would claim that though the household itself doesn't include all the people who visit the household, because the household, in this case, is set up in such a way to accommodate visitors, they're very frequently visitors in these places, especially to the collections, but even to, like the frog observations. He notes at one point, I had my eyes on these frogs and I was waiting for it to happen, but then I was interrupted by my colleagues, Monsieur so-and-so and Mr. so-and-so, and they came in and I missed it, right? So you get from that there are people coming and going all the time, and I think that's important. So we can see also how these households, or this household in this case, are linked to other venues like the Academy of Sciences. I haven't developed that here, but that's totally part of this. And also to people in other places who are, let's say, collecting birds or collecting insects in China or the Antilles or wherever, and sending them to Paris. So the household is not an insular unit at all. It's very much connected outward. And it's not even exclusively private, which we tend to think of, the domestic and the private as a category, but it's not really all that private. But that there are features of particular households that make particular kinds of knowledge possible. And I tried to show you some of those examples. I could multiply the examples. So, ideally, in reconstructing this kind of work, I'm trying to figure out, who all the people were who were involved. But after a certain point, like you have to sort of throw up your hands and recognize that you're never going to know like who was there like all the time. But it is interesting how there's this sort of stream of people. If you look through the years at all the people who worked with Réaumur, it's quite a long list. And I still have work to do on figuring out some things about some of them. So I think of these people as the not so invisible technicians, to use Chapin's terminology there, because they really aren't invisible. There's all kinds of ways that you can sort of catch sight of them. And in fact, people like Brisson and Hérisson, they had their own careers, either during or after their stint as Réaumur's assistant. And so that's another way in which, what happens in the household is very much, it's very fluid, and it's very much connected outward into the rest of the world. And I think that's one of the things that makes this kind of story interesting, is that it sort of gets ramified in lots of different ways. But I do think that the thinking about the kind of work that's made possible by people who live together in the same space and have certain resources available is an interesting way to get at some of this work. Okay, I'll quit there.